After a lifetime of being treated like I was worthless, my adoptive parents stood in front of a judge to tell the world, and me, that they wanted nothing more to do with me. I could feel the very foundations of my world just collapsing, the cold, stale air of the courtroom making it hard to draw a full breath. They had always called me their little miracle, a precious name they'd whisper when friends were around, but right then, in front of a room full of strangers, I was just some terrible mistake they were trying to publicly erase. Their lawyer, a man with a face as sharp and unforgiving as his suit, kept using words I'd never heard before, like adoption dissolution. I didn't know the legal term, but the chill that ran down my spine told me exactly what it meant. They were returning me. Like I was a defective product you take back to the store, receipt in hand. I could feel the phantom sensation of their sharp elbows in my memory, a constant nagging pressure pushing me aside at countless family gatherings, nudging me just out of frame in family photos, always making it painfully clear that I was in the way. And now they were doing it one last time for the public record. I was 18 years old, a legal adult by the calendar, and they were in court to formally and finally shove me out of their lives for good. My breath hitched in my throat, my hands grew clammy and cold, and a wave of bottomless despair washed over me, so heavy it felt like I was drowning. I could feel every single person in that sterile room staring, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. This was it. The ultimate, undeniable rejection. But what my parents didn't know, what I was only moments away from discovering, was that the judge sitting on the bench, a woman watching my utter humiliation with an unnerving intensity, had just stumbled onto a buried secret about my past. A secret that was locked away in sealed records. A secret so powerful it wouldn't just change everything in that courtroom. It would unravel and then remake my entire life. This is just the beginning of a story about deception and the fight for the truth. If you want to see how this shocking courtroom secret unravels my entire life, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single moment. Your support helps bring powerful stories like this to light, so be sure to comment and share. My life, as far as I knew it, started in fragmented pieces, cobbled together from hushed whispers I overheard from social workers and the cold, impersonal files that followed me like a shadow from one foster home to another in Atlanta. I was a quiet kid, a little black girl with 2 neat braids my foster mom would hastily weave each morning, and eyes that saw way too much for their age. The orphanage was just a collection of lonely sounds, the constant squeaking of sneakers on worn linoleum, the distant, muffled cry of a baby in another room, and the painfully fake cheerfulness in the staff's voices. I learned very young how to make myself small, to exist in the margins of every room. It was simply safer there. But even though I was small and quiet, my dreams were huge. They were filled with vibrant color, of a real house with a lush green lawn, a bedroom that was truly mine, and the one thing I wanted more than anything in the universe. A mom and a dad who loved me unconditionally, no matter what. When I was 8, that dream came true. Or so I believed. They walked into the drab visitor's room, and it was like they were sparkling, like 2 people who had stepped directly out of a fairy tale. Linda and Robert Thompson. She was all sharp angles and a bright, almost overwhelmingly loud energy, with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that scanned me with an intensity that was both thrilling and terrifying. He was tall and stern-faced, with a deep voice that rumbled in his chest when he spoke. They were so white. It wasn't just the color of their skin. It was their crisp, expensive clothes, the way they smelled like fancy laundry detergent and a faint hint of something floral. This entire aura of a world so clean and orderly and perfect it felt like it was on another planet. "Well, hello there, Aisha," Linda said, her voice like a practiced song. She knelt down in front of me, her smile so wide and brilliant it crinkled the corners of her eyes. "We've been waiting so very long to meet you. You're our little miracle." Miracle. The word just bounced around in the empty spaces of my head. Nobody had ever called me that before. I was a case file. Number. A problem to be managed. But to them I was a miracle. The long drive from the familiar gray of Atlanta to their huge house in a place called Ohio was a total blur of overwhelming hope. I just sat silently in the back of their perfect new-smelling car, drawing little hearts on the foggy window, my small bag of worldly possessions, a worn-out teddy bear with one button eye and a couple of threadbare outfits, sitting next to me like a ghost from my old life, a life I prayed was over for good. Linda talked the entire way, her voice a constant, cheerful stream, painting this amazing picture of my new life. You'll have your very own room, sweetie, decorated just for you, and a swing set in the backyard. We have a wonderful church, and everyone there is just so excited to welcome you into our family. Robert was much quieter. He'd glance at me in the rearview mirror every so often, and his gaze felt less like a loving father and more like he was inspecting a recent purchase. But not even his unnerving silence could extinguish the fire of hope that was burning so brightly inside me. He was a dad. My dad. The word itself felt incredible on my tongue, foreign and wonderful. Their house was even bigger and more perfect than I had dared to imagine. A grand 2-story colonial with gleaming white siding and a lawn so perfectly manicured it looked like a green carpet. Inside, everything was immaculate. Plush white carpets, gleaming hardwood floors, and furniture that looked like it was for display in a magazine, not for actual living. My room was just like Linda had promised, a total fantasy ripped from a little girl's dream. It had soft lavender walls, a majestic canopy bed with a frilly pink comforter, and a bookshelf filled with brand new dolls in pristine boxes, all staring at me with their blank plastic eyes. For the first few months, it was a honeymoon. Perfect, fragile dream. Linda baked cookies with me, her arm resting warmly and reassuringly around my shoulders as I learned to measure flour. Robert read to me every night, his deep, stern voice getting softer and gentler for the different characters in the stories. They showed me off everywhere, at church, to their endless stream of friends at neighborhood gatherings. "This is Aisha," they'd say, their hands resting proudly on my shoulders as they beamed. "Our daughter." You could feel the waves of praise they received for it. They were heroes, saints who had selflessly rescued a poor, unlucky child from a bleak future. And I tried so hard to be the perfect daughter they deserved. I was quiet, relentlessly polite, and endlessly grateful. I washed my hands until they were raw and chapped before every single meal. I never made a mess. I was playing the part of a lifetime, just desperate for it to become real. But miracles I was about to learn have an expiration date. The change was slow at first, almost imperceptible, like the air getting colder degree by degree. It started with a sigh. I asked for help with my math homework, and a tired, impatient sigh escaped Linda's perfect lips. Then came the little comments, each one as sharp and stinging as a paper cut. "We didn't sign up for this," Robert muttered under his breath when I accidentally tracked a little bit of mud onto the pristine white hallway runner. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but I did, and the words landed like heavy rocks in the pit of my stomach. Signed up for what? A real, living girl who sometimes makes mistakes. A child, not a doll. The genuine warmth in their eyes started to disappear, replaced by a cold, calculating look I couldn't decipher. The spontaneous hugs became rare, and then non-existent. Their hands on my shoulders were no longer a gesture of pride but a way to steer me out of their path. I started to feel like one of the dolls on my shelf, something to be put on display and admired from a safe distance, but not really touched, not really loved. The beautiful, immaculate house began to feel less like a home and more like a museum. I was the one exhibit they were starting to deeply regret buying. The dream wasn't just fading, it was twisting and curdling into a nightmare. This journey from a dream come true to a living nightmare is intense, I know. If you believe stories of survival and justice need to be heard, support the channel by subscribing and hitting the like button. Comment below with your thoughts so far, and share this video to help others find strength and resilience. By the time I hit 10 years old, the honeymoon was definitively over. The chill had settled deep into the bones of our family, and the neglect started to become more obvious, more deliberate, and more cruel. It was as if they had a secret daily lesson plan for teaching me how utterly worthless I was. And the first, most effective tool they used was hunger. The refrigerator, which used to be this magical box of endless food and treats, became a fortress. One afternoon I came home from school, my stomach rumbling, and saw a small, shiny padlock on its door. "You're eating us out of house and home, Aisha," Linda said when I asked about it. Her voice was no longer sweet and song-like. It was thin and sharp like a shard of glass. "A girl your size doesn't need to eat so much. We're doing this for your own good." Their pantry was always overflowing with gourmet food for themselves. Fancy cheeses, imported olives, expensive crackers, cases of wine. My food was relegated to one single sad shelf. A box of store-brand cereal, a loaf of bread that was always on the verge of going stale, and a few cans of bland generic label soup. I was constantly, achingly hungry. It was this constant, gnawing feeling that dominated my thoughts. I would lie in my canopy bed at night, my stomach hurting with a dull, persistent ache, listening to the sounds of their laughter and the clinking of their wine glasses drifting up from downstairs. I became resourceful, a scavenger in my own house. I'd sneak leftover crusts from their plates when they were clearing the table or quickly grab an apple from the fruit bowl on the counter when Linda was distracted on the phone, my heart pounding with a toxic mix of guilt and the raw fear of getting caught. They started calling me a charity case, a name that dripped with so much resentment, as if my very existence was a financial weight they were tired of carrying. The neglect spread to everything. While Linda was buying new, fashionable clothes every season, mine came from dusty garage sales or the church donation bin. Nothing ever fit right. The jeans were always too short, the shirts too big, and everything was faded from countless previous washes. At school, I'd see the other girls in their new, bright, stylish clothes and just feel this hot, suffocating shame creeping up my neck. I'd try to hide the frayed hem of my sweater or pull my sleeves down over my hands, just trying to become invisible. When I finally got the courage to point out a gaping hole in my only pair of sneakers, Robert just looked down at me with his cold, dismissive stare. "Be grateful you have shoes at all," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "There are children in the world with nothing." He had no idea, or perhaps he didn't care, that he was actively making sure I was one of them. But the worst part, the thing that truly defined the unique brand of their cruelty, was what I came to call the cold elbows. It wasn't just a physical thing. It became a symbol for my entire life with them. It was this sharp, deliberate jab, a physical manifestation of them shoving me aside. Whenever guests came over for dinner, Linda would walk up to me with a fake, brittle smile plastered on her face. "Move over, Aisha, you're in the way," she'd hiss, her voice a poison whisper meant only for me, as her elbow dug hard into my ribs, pushing me unceremoniously against the wall. To the guests, it probably looked like a casual, harmless touch. But I felt the sting, the sharp pain, and I knew about the ugly purple bruise that would show up later, a secret, painful map of their constant rejection. Robert did it too, but with more force, more malice. If I was sitting on the sofa watching TV, he'd sit down next to me and just use his elbow to push me over, bit by bit, silently and relentlessly, until I was perched on the very edge, about to fall off the couch. There was never an "excuse me," never a word. It was a silent, powerful statement. "This isn't your space. You don't belong here." It happened everywhere. At church, during family photos, they'd strategically stick me on the end and then subtly elbow me just out of the shot. It happened in the grocery store if I was blocking the cart for a split second. Every single jab was another brutal reminder. I was an inconvenience, a blemish, a stain on their perfect white world. They had adopted a little black girl, gotten all the social credit and praise for being so charitable and progressive, and now they were stuck with the reality of me. And they hated it. I believed them completely. I internalized their message until it became my own truth. I started to think there was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with me. Was I just unlovable? Was it the color of my skin? I'd look in the mirror at my dark skin, my coiled, kinky hair, my brown eyes, and I started to believe that these were the reasons they hated me. This horrible, twisting guilt burrowed deep inside me. Maybe if I were quieter, smaller. Maybe if I were whiter. Maybe then they would love me. I tried even harder to be perfect, to be invisible, but it was no use. The cold elbows always found me, and they always reminded me of my place. On the outside, looking in. The cruelty escalated as I grew older. The accidents started happening more often and were harder to explain away. The year I turned 12, they were getting ready for their annual, highly anticipated Christmas card photo. Linda had bought us all matching red sweaters to create the perfect image of a happy family. We were standing on the landing of their grand, curving staircase, and Linda was yanking a comb through my thick hair so roughly it made my eyes water. "Hold still," she snapped, her frustration palpable. Robert moved behind me, pretending to get himself into position for the photo. "Okay, on 3. The photographer called up from the bottom of the stairs. Just as he said the word 2, I felt a sudden, brutal slam in the middle of my back. It was Robert's elbow, a powerful, vicious, and deliberate shove. My feet went completely out from under me, and I tumbled head over heels down the entire flight of carpeted stairs. I landed in a painful, tangled heap at the bottom, a searing, white-hot pain shooting through my left arm. For a split second, there was just shocked silence. Then Linda let out a piercing, dramatic gasp. "Oh my goodness! Aisha, are you okay? She's so clumsy, the poor thing." Robert rushed down the stairs, his face a perfect mask of paternal concern that never, for a second, reached his cold, empty eyes. The photographer was horrified. My arm was broken. At the hospital, Linda played the part of the devoted, worried mother to perfection. She cried for the doctors, she wrung her hands for the nurses, telling them all, "She's just always been a bit clumsy. We do our best, but you know, she's at that awkward age." I saw teachers who were called exchange concerned looks, and I'm sure there were whispers and suspicions about home issues, but no one ever said anything directly to her. Her act was simply too convincing. The ugly, telltale bruises that sometimes appeared on my skin were always explained away as my own fault. I was trapped in her narrative, a clumsy, difficult, accident-prone child. A few months later, I found something that made everything even more confusing and terrifying. I couldn't sleep one night. The familiar hunger pains were back, gnawing at my stomach. I crept downstairs as quietly as I could, hoping to grab a piece of bread from the pantry without being noticed. As I got near their home office, I heard their voices. I pressed my ear flat against the cold wood of the door. "And what about the results?" Linda was saying, her voice tense. "I told you," Robert's deep voice rumbled back, laced with annoyance. "That DNA test we did secretly. It confirms she's not related to anyone we know. Just some orphan mix-up. We should have done it before we signed the final papers." "So the story her social worker told us was all a lie?" Linda asked, her voice rising slightly. "Who cares? The point is, she's a dead end," Robert said with chilling finality. My heart was beating so hard and so loud I was sure they would hear it through the thick door. A secret DNA test. They had taken a sample from me without me ever knowing. A few strands of hair from my brush, maybe. A cotton swab while I was asleep. They had investigated my very biology like I was a science experiment. And they were profoundly disappointed with the results. Not related to anyone we know. What on earth did that even mean? Why would they ever think I was related to someone they knew? What story had the social worker told them in the first place? My own identity, which was already a blurry, undefined thing, was now covered in this thick, impenetrable fog of secrets. They knew something about where I came from, and whatever it was, it had made them test my DNA and then coldly dismiss me as a dead end. The emotional abuse got worse, more inventive. At 14, they made me join the church youth group. All for show, for appearances, I realized later. But at every single event, the cold elbows were there, a constant presence, pushing me to the side, reminding me I didn't belong. One night, Linda did something so twisted it messed with my head for days. It was my birthday, and for the first time in years, she baked me a cake. A real homemade chocolate cake. A tiny, fragile bit of hope flickered inside me. Maybe this was it. Maybe things were finally changing. I watched her put it on the table, complete with flickering candles. For just a second, I saw the ghost of the woman who had once called me her miracle. Can any of my friends come over?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the spell. Her face went hard in an instant. The warmth vanished. "Friends? What friends? You don't have any friends," she sneered, the words like a slap. I started to cry, silent tears rolling down my cheeks. The fragile hope was shattered into a million pieces. Seeing my tears, she just snapped. "Oh, stop it. You ungrateful little brat," she spat, her voice venomous. With a sudden violent motion, she grabbed the cake and smashed it, face down, onto the kitchen floor. The plate shattered, and it felt like my heart shattered right along with it. Then came the elbow, a hard, punitive jab into my shoulder blade that made me gasp for air. That night I started writing. I found an old, dusty notebook in the back of a drawer and poured everything out onto the pages. I wrote about the locked fridge, the garage sale clothes, the gnawing hunger. I wrote about the cold elbows, the cruel names, the soul-crushing loneliness. I wrote about the smashed birthday cake and the overheard conversation about the secret DNA test. It became my journal of secrets, a careful, meticulous record of my pain. I hid it under a loose floorboard beneath my bed. I didn't know it then, but I was gathering evidence. I was arming myself for a fight I didn't even know was coming. The breaking point finally came when I was 16. It was the annual church picnic, an event Linda and Robert never missed. Not for their love of God, but for the social points it scored them within their community. I was trailing behind them as usual, an unwanted shadow they were forced to drag along. Robert was holding court with some of the church elders, laughing and smiling. I was standing nearby, trying my best to look like I belonged, to not be an embarrassment. He needed to get past me to grab a napkin from the table. Instead of just saying a simple, "Excuse me," he did it. Cold elbow. But this time was different. It wasn't a subtle nudge. It was a hard, violent shove, and it was public. He rammed his elbow into my side with so much force that I stumbled sideways and crashed right into the sharp corner of a wooden picnic table. A collective gasp went through the little crowd. A sharp, searing pain exploded in my mouth. I put my hand to my lips and it came away sticky and bright red with blood. He had split my lip open. For a few horrifying seconds, everything just froze. Robert's face was a storm of pure anger, not because of what he'd done to me, but because I was causing a scene, drawing attention. "For God's sake, Aisha, watch where you're going," he snarled, instantly blaming me. Linda rushed over, her face a perfect mask of practiced panic. "Oh, honey. Are you okay? She just tripped everyone. So clumsy." But this time the lie didn't work. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. People saw the cold, unadulterated fury in his eyes just before he spoke. They saw the blood dripping down my chin. That night something inside me just snapped. The years of fear and self-blame and guilt burned away in an instant, and all that was left was this hard, cold, defiant anger. The car ride home was dead silent, thick with unspoken rage. As soon as the front door closed behind us, I turned to face them, my split lip throbbing painfully. "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking but clear and steady for the first time in my life. "Why do you hate me so much?" Linda let out a short, bitter laugh. It was the most honest sound I had ever heard from her. "Hate you? Oh honey, we don't hate you. We just regret you. We adopted you for the praise," Robert added, his voice dripping with venom, all pretense gone. "For the tax write-off, for the pats on the back at church. Oh, the Thompsons, they're such good people, taking in that poor little black girl. We thought it would be easy. But you're just so difficult." The confession hung in the air between us, ugly and final. I was never their daughter. I was a project, failed investment, prop. So I was just a prop. I screamed, the tears I had held back for years finally breaking loose in a torrent of pain and rage. "Something to make you look good." The fight exploded. Yelling, screaming, years of buried resentment pouring out from all sides. In the middle of it all, Robert's face twisted with uncontrollable rage. He raised his fist to hit me. I flinched, bracing for the impact. But the blow never came. In that split second of hesitation, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Not fear of hurting me, but fear of the consequences if someone found out. That was it. I turned and ran. I didn't grab a single thing. Not my journal, not my teddy bear. I just bolted out the front door and sprinted down the dark street until I got to a neighbor's house. She was a kind older woman who had always looked at me with sad, knowing eyes over the fence. I collapsed on her doorstep, sobbing uncontrollably, the whole horrific story pouring out of me in a jumbled, desperate mess. She didn't hesitate for a moment. She took one look at my split lip, at the raw terror in my eyes, and she called child services. That night, a formal investigation began. It was a dizzying whirlwind of social workers, therapists, and police officers. They took pictures of my bleeding lip and of the old, faded bruises on my arms and ribs, a painful hidden map of a decade of accidents. The perfect, white picket fence world of Linda and Robert Thompson was about to come crashing down around them. And for the very first time in my life, I felt a tiny, terrifying flicker of hope. Justice, it turned out, had a voice. And it was mine. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and depositions. My case was assigned to the Honorable Elena Vasquez, a name that would soon change the entire trajectory of my life. She was an imposing figure in her black robes, serious and focused, but when her eyes met mine across the courtroom for the first time, I saw something that completely surprised me: empathy. A distinct flicker of warmth in the cold, sterile environment. For the first time, I felt like someone in a position of power actually saw me, not just the file with my name on it. The state had built a strong case. My social worker, a determined woman named Mrs. Gable, stood in court and laid out all the evidence methodically. She showed the court the extensive medical records, a long, documented history of my so-called falls and accidents. She had statements from teachers who had suspected something was wrong for years but felt powerless to intervene against the formidable Thompsons. And then she held up my journal. My heart jumped into my throat. She opened it to a bookmarked page and began to read my secret, painful words out loud into the silent courtroom. October 12th. The fridge is locked again. I ate the crusts from Linda's plate when she wasn't looking. Feel like a rat. Am I a rat? November 3rd, church photo day. Dad elbowed me so hard I stumbled out of the picture. Linda said I ruined it. The photo is on the mantelpiece now. Without me. January 22nd, my birthday. Linda made a cake and then smashed it on the floor because I cried. She called me an ungrateful brat. The worst part was that for a second I thought she loved me. With every single word she read, you could feel the atmosphere in the room change. The carefully constructed story Linda and Robert had built, the narrative of being loving, charitable parents saddled with a difficult, troubled child, was starting to crumble into dust. When it was their turn, they put on a masterclass performance in deception. Linda cried on the stand, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. We loved her so much, she wept, her voice thick with fake emotion. We gave her everything. But she was just so angry all the time. Robert sat there with a somber expression, looking like a long-suffering, patient father pushed to his limit. We tried our best. It's a genuine tragedy that she has turned against us like this. They even had a therapist, one they had paid for handsomely, who testified that I had reactive attachment disorder and was known to make up elaborate stories for attention. They were trying to gaslight the entire court, to paint me as delusional and untrustworthy. But Judge Vasquez wasn't buying any of it. Her questions were sharp, precise, and relentless. Mr. Thompson, she began, her gaze fixed on him. You claim Aisha is clumsy. Yet the medical records show a pattern of injuries consistent with directed force, not accidental falls. Can you explain that discrepancy? She was a child. Kids fall, Robert mumbled, avoiding her eyes. And Mrs. Thompson, the judge continued, turning her attention to Linda. You claim you loved her so much, yet you admit you padlocked the refrigerator. Is withholding food a standard demonstration of love in your household? It was for her health. To control her portions. Linda insisted, her voice getting high and strained with panic. Judge Vasquez leaned forward, her expression hardening. This isn't a case of difficult parenting, she stated, her voice ringing with authority that silenced the room. The evidence presented here, the journal, the medical reports, the clear pattern of physical and emotional isolation, points not to a parental struggle, but to calculated, systematic cruelty. With every single lie she exposed, I felt a little bit stronger, a little bit taller in my chair. Their perfect, polished facade was cracking right before my eyes, and for the first time, I let myself imagine a future where I was finally truly free. On the final day of the hearing, Linda and Robert made their last, desperate move. They filed a formal petition for adoption dissolution. Since I had just turned 18, they argued they should be allowed to legally sever all parental ties and responsibilities. It was their last public shove, their final, official attempt to erase me from their lives and their history. I sat there listening to their lawyer argue for their right to formally disown me, and the fragile hope I'd been building started to fall apart all over again. Then, something unbelievable happened. After their lawyer finished his argument, Judge Vasquez suddenly and unexpectedly called for a recess. She looked directly at me. "Miss Thompson, a word in my chambers, please. With your social worker." My heart pounded against my ribs. What now? Had I done something wrong? Linda and Robert shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred as I followed the bailiff through a side door and into the judge's private office. Judge Vasquez closed the door and took off her glasses, rubbing her eyes. In an instant, the stern, imposing judge was gone. In her place was a woman with a look of deep, earth-shattering sadness etched on her face. Her voice, when she spoke, was just a whisper. "Aisha," she began, her hand shaking slightly as she picked up a thick file from her desk. "I've been doing some digging on my own. Something about your case. It felt strangely familiar to me. Your last name at the orphanage. It was listed as Vasquez." I couldn't breathe. The air was trapped in my lungs. Based on some inconsistencies in the initial adoption paperwork, I used my judicial authority to look into the sealed records from your birth. She took a deep, shaky breath, as if steeling herself. "I know what I did was unorthodox. A judge isn't supposed to conduct their own investigation or unseal confidential records. People will say it violates a dozen rules of judicial ethics. And they're probably right. But I had to know." She opened the file and turned it around for me to see. "Your biological mother's name was Maria Vasquez. She was my younger sister." The world just stopped moving. The sound in the room faded to a dull roar. My mother, her sister. "Maria, she was very young and very poor," Judge Vasquez continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. "She passed away during childbirth. I was just starting law school. I had no money, no way to take you in myself. I was told by social services that you were placed in a loving, stable home." She slid a document across the desk toward me. It was a statement from an old family friend. Linda and Robert Thompson knew our family. They knew about Maria and her situation. They committed fraud, Aisha. They faked documents, claiming you were a distant relative of theirs so they could bypass the normal, lengthy adoption process and get additional state benefits. They knew who you were all along, Aisha. They knew you were my niece. And they buried it all. The secret DNA test. It all slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. They weren't testing to see if I was related to someone they knew. They were testing to confirm that I wasn't related to them, to make absolutely sure their fraudulent secret stayed buried. The dead end they had talked about was the fact that I had no genetic link to their family, which they already knew. I stared at the woman across the desk. My aunt. The kind eyes that I had noticed on the very first day in court. They were my mother's eyes. My blood was roaring in my ears. I wasn't some random, unlucky orphan. Had a family. Had a history. And it had all been stolen from me. "I am so sorry, Aisha," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "They stole you. They stole you from us." When we walked back into the courtroom a few minutes later, it was dead silent. Linda and Robert looked annoyed, impatient to be done with me forever so they could get on with their perfect lives. They had no idea their world was about to end. Judge Vasquez took her seat, her face now a mask of cold, controlled fury. She looked directly at Linda and Robert. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, she began, her voice low but shaking the very walls of the courtroom. I am recusing myself from this case, effective immediately, due to a profound and deeply personal conflict of interest. A confused murmur filled the room. Their lawyer looked baffled. However, she continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that was more terrifying than any shout. Before I do, new evidence of a staggering case of adoption fraud, perjury, and conspiracy has come to my attention. Panic flashed in Linda's eyes. Robert went pale, the color draining from his face. For 10 years, the judge boomed, her voice rising with every word, you have systematically abused a child whose identity you deliberately and maliciously concealed. A child you took under false pretenses for your own financial gain and social status. She laid it all out. Her relationship to me, my mother's tragic story, the fraudulent adoption paperwork. The courtroom erupted into chaos. I realize my next actions will be viewed as highly irregular, the judge said, her eyes sweeping the stunned room. But the fraud uncovered here is so egregious, so monstrous, that it demands an immediate and decisive response. She turned to the bailiffs standing by the wall. Based on the clear evidence of felony fraud, I am issuing an emergency judicial order to freeze all known assets of Robert and Linda Thompson, pending a full criminal investigation. Then she looked at the two people who had made my life a living hell. And I am ordering you to be taken into custody immediately. The district attorney will be taking over this matter. It was pure chaos. Linda started screaming, this raw, animal sound of pure terror and disbelief. Robert just stared, his face slack with shock, as the bailiffs moved toward them and took out their handcuffs. Their church friends, who had come to support them, looked on in abject horror. As the cold metal cuffs clicked shut around Linda's wrists, her eyes met mine one last time. There was no hatred left in them, just pathetic, desperate pleading. It was far too late for that. The cold elbows that had pushed me to the margins of my own life for a decade had finally become the chains that would drag them down into the darkness they had created. A new judge was assigned to my case. The fraudulent adoption was nullified, erased as if it never happened. A reparations trust was set up for me from the Thompsons' frozen assets to compensate for a decade of a stolen childhood, abuse, and neglect. And most importantly, legal guardianship was transferred to my aunt Elena. I walked out of that courthouse not as a rejected orphan, not as a charity case, but as Aisha Vasquez. I walked out into the bright sun, holding my aunt's hand, and walked directly into a family I never knew I had. Grandparents, cousins, a whole loving family that had been looking for me for 18 long years. They didn't see a burden or a project. They saw their long-lost kin. They saw Maria's daughter. The justice I found that day wasn't about revenge. It wasn't just about seeing Linda and Robert punished, though there was a deep and profound satisfaction in that. True justice was the truth. It was the reclaiming of my story, the rebirth of my identity. For 18 years they had made me believe I was an outsider, a girl who was always in the way, a problem to be managed. But I was never the outsider. I was the missing piece of a family that was desperately, lovingly searching for me. The girl they tried so hard to elbow into silence now stood tall, her voice strong and clear, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest, most hopeless places, the truth will eventually, one way or another, find its way to the light. Thank you for witnessing my journey to justice. There's so many stories like mine that need a voice. To help us continue sharing powerful narratives of truth and resilience, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to leave a like and comment below with your biggest takeaway from my story. Your engagement makes all the difference.